can get started. Um, all right, so welcome everybody. Thanks for joining today. So just to give a little intro about myself, I'm career coach Apira. I do leadership coaching. I've been working officially as a people manager for one of the top 5 Canadian banks for about 3 years. Prior to that, I was in like supervisor positions and things like that. So overall leadership, I would say about 5 years. So I am experienced in that, and I would love to share those tips. So if you ever do want to learn about that, feel free to reach out. Follow me on Instagram at careercoach.apira. Or my email is apiraraja@gmail.com. I will make sure to put that in the chat. I'll type it actually right now. So if you ever have any questions, you can always email me. Just to give you a little bit of info about, what we're doing today um, and I guess the goal for today is we're really focusing on interview skills. Um, I'll get Michelle to introduce herself in a moment, but she's an interview coach, and so I'm really excited to get her advice and tips on how to approach interviewing in a way where it's like, we're not going in there so with such a nervous wreck. Typically, I know for me, if I'm speaking about myself, I tend to go into interviews where, I Google what are these top question interview questions for this role and try to practice those questions. I'm not a great interviewer. I get really nervous, and I've luckily have had some really good managers that have interviewed me before who are like, I know interviews are tense, and they came with a really positive and good energy, and they're like, we're just having a conversation. And I think those are like the best way to interview because, you can come in with practice questions, but obviously the manager at the end of the day wants to really get to know you as a person. What are your skills that you're bringing? So if you're so nervous and tensed up about whether you're getting something right or wrong, you know, that's not great you're probably not communicating your skills the best way, and it's probably not like that manager that's interviewing you is probably not going to really get what out the best out of you. And even if you are like the best qualified candidate, but if you're not communicating it well and you're really tense and nervous, that's not gonna come across the best way. And so I'm really excited to hear from Michelle and her approach. I think it's going to be really great. So, yeah, that's the little intro. Michelle, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here with my emotional support tea. And to talk about interviewing, I'm branching out a little bit from interviewing to doing some additional career coaching, some additional aspects of that, with a somewhat of a focus on folks working in higher ed or looking for jobs in higher ed. But bigger picture, I'm here to help folks who kind of dread those interview conversations, and that especially if the thought of interviewing kind of drags down your whole career, or drags down your whole job search. You are really, and if you're thoughtful and really wanting to figure out who you are as a person and communicate that effectively, I'm here. You're probably a good fit to work with me. If you want to go into our next slide, I have a little prompt for us. I'm going to talk a little bit just about my approach and what makes me different, what makes working with me different from the classic strategy that Apira described, which is let's get our crystal ball out and try to guess what questions they're going to ask us, and let's come up with answers to those questions, and let's memorize those answers. And which, if that is working for you, fantastic. If you're Googling the articles and you're practicing, if that's working for you, fantastic. Maybe something I say will be helpful to you. But I am really all about if that strategy was working, I don't think you'd be here. So as we're going to come back to this prompt at the end of our time together. So what I want you to be thinking about is significant things, significant moments, the things that stand out to you throughout your professional experience. And it can be it can be anything that comes to mind when I say, what are the memorable things about your professional experience? For me, just as an example, for me, one of the examples I give is I was working with a client and I made a suggestion. While he was really struggling to communicate and just rambling, and I was kind of getting bored. I was kind of falling asleep a little bit, and I made a little suggestion that he and talk to me, that he speak as if he was speaking to a trusted colleague. And then it was like a light switch flipped, and suddenly he was talking in a more engaged fashion. He became the most interesting person in the world, as opposed to like the least interesting guy on the planet. And it was amazing, and that was a really significant moment for me. And I can talk more about why later in our activity, but just as an example of a moment, that's an example of a moment. Okay, so in our next slide, I think is where we talk a little bit about, if you want to switch to that, Apira. We tried to get me to share my screen, but my computer was like, no, we're not sharing any screens today. So in terms of what is different about the way I approach interviewing, is I'm not looking for, I don't promise, not helping you find easy solutions. We're not hacking an interview. We're not like, there's no magic trick to this. But what we are going to do is we are going to build your skills and your confidence as an interviewee. Another way we're going to do this is we're not going to try to guess what they want to hear. There is so much rhetoric out there about, oh, I said the wrong thing, or oh, I don't know if I got that question right, or oh, we're not going to worry about that because we don't know. We can't possibly know what they want to hear. But what we will be working toward is, for every time you leave an interview, I want you to feel like you put your best foot forward. You communicated effectively about yourself, and you feel good about what you said in that interview. And then, of course, no more anxiety might be putting it a little, we might be putting a little pressure on me there, or a little pressure on you. I'm not saying it'll not be, there will be no more anxiety really, but that's our goal. Is we don't want you to feel anxious going into an interview. We want you to feel like you are capable of authentically showing up, talking about yourself, and your value and why it is that somebody should hire you. So, and then in our next slide. So what am I hoping for you? I want you to go in feeling ready. I want you to go in feeling good. And I want you to come out feeling like you had a good conversation. And then on the next slide, we start. Oh, I also like to talk about how, by the way, my background includes graduate work in systematic inequality and privilege, and appearance privilege was what I did my dissertation research in. And apparel design is what my PhD is. So if you want to talk about what to wear in an interview, I'm also delighted to talk about what you should wear. And we can do if you want, you can show me your clothes, and we can help talk through your three-dimensional self and how you want to construct yourself and put yourself out there in the world, when outside of just what you say. Okay, so then the next couple slides are
Actually,
sorry, go ahead. Is there a question?
yeah, so actually before we continue to your next slide, I actually want to just touch on what you've talked about, the anxiety and how you help people be more confident in going into their interview. So I just want to put out a question to the group. How many of you have felt that way, feel that anxious going into an interview? Have any of you, you know, do you have those fears? Do you have those feelings? Or have you ever experienced that? So I'm going to put it in the chat, and I'm just curious to hear your thoughts. Sorry, Michelle, please continue.
No, that's great. I love it. Especially if there are folks who like interviews, because I want to talk to you after and get the secret sauce on that.
That'd be great.
All right. So just the way I reframe interviewing is, and none of this just feels like rocket science to me, but it it does help me feel like when I realized all of these things a few years ago, I realized, oh, right, I didn't have to have worried about this for the previous 15 years of my professional life. Like I didn't have to, I, I don't want it to take everybody else as long as it took me to get to a place of feeling comfortable in an interview context. So reframing an interview away from this is an exam, they're going to ask me questions and I have to have the right answer. I want to think about it as a conversation between colleagues where these are people who are interested in what I'm doing. They know a little bit about what I do and why and how I do it. They know a little bit about what I've done in the past, and they're here to talk to me about those things, about what I've done in the past and how I've done it and how I approach, being a part of a team and being an employee. And then, so an extension of that is instead of looking for those right answers, we're really going to try and treat those interview questions, and they're not exam questions, they're conversation prompts. And that really frees us up to, if we get caught out by a question that maybe we're not sure we have an exact answer for, or I don't know, something that I tend to do is I get caught up on the specifics of something, and that just takes me down a whole path of I don't have anything to say, even though I have plenty to say, if I can treat that question as a topic, as a conversational prompt, and then respond with something that's on topic and carry and participate and hold up my end of that conversation. And then the whole guessing what questions we're going to be asked thing, like I understand why we do it, because what we want as humans, we want answers. We want someone to tell us that this is the way, this is the question we're going to be asked. But since we cannot possibly, we're going to lose that game, I want us to be prepared to answer whatever question or to talk about every topic and to talk about ourselves really effectively, no matter what they say. And this is not to say that we won't practice with a list of the top 10 questions for project managers or whatever. We can totally do that after we go through a process of helping you figure out who am I as a professional, what are the important things that have happened to me in my career, what does that say about myself, all of that kind of thing. All right, I think this is a thread of 2 slides. It's not a super dramatic thing, but I was like, ooh, a thread, I don't know. Part 2, we got a 2-part thing here. And so the other things that will parts of my reframe of how I think about job interviews, instead of the right answers, we're going to look for you to talk effectively about yourself. And effectiveness is part of rhetorical analysis, which is really understanding the context. Who am I as a messenger? Who's my audience? What's the message I want to communicate? And what does that audience need from me in order to understand what I'm trying to communicate? And so part of that is knowing how to be professional, and we're going to complicate that when we talk about, what does professional mean in your specific context, and how comfortable are those ideas about professionalism, and kind of work within that so that you'll be able to communicate authentically. And then preparing the packets, I talk about, there's a lot of the packets are just how I talk about stories, the things that we say about, or the things that we can be prepared to talk about ourselves, and then we can have those stories that we can present as in response to whatever comes up, and that's kind of the line between having an answer ready for a specific question and being prepared to answer everything. The way we do that is we have stories that really well, and those stories they're useful for lots of different situations. When you tell a story about something that when you have a prepared story, you can use that story to answer any number of questions. And then really, I want to help you feel like you really have dialed in your professional authenticity, because we're all performing roles all the time, and some of us have have less distance between our personal and our professional roles. I have a teaching role that I get into that I really love, but it's not really the same as if I'm at a party or something. Because then, if I don't have a job to do, I'm kind of like, I don't know what's going on here. But you give me something to teach somebody, and I'll be okay. Here's This is how we do it. So we're always performing in whatever context we're in. And so an interview is a very specific context, and I want to help you be authentic and professional. Most of us, are authentic, at home self isn't the same as our professional self. And there are lots of aspects of that we'll kind of work through together. So um, yeah, being yourself within the framework of what's expected, kind of cramming ourselves inside the premise to the extent we want to. We don't always want to. Sometimes we want to be, a trailblazer, or we want to really disrupt norms. And I'm here to help you do that too, but also want you to get the job. So there's a real balance there. Okay, what do I have on our next slide here? Okay, so let's stop and do, before we come back to this, and Apira, do you want to, you can maybe stop the screen share for now if you want, if there are questions, or if there's anything else we want to talk about.
Yeah, I really liked, actually, just before I go to the audience, just on what you said in a couple of these slides, wanted to point out, because I thought they were really interesting, that the first thing about where you mentioned, like, the balance between your authentic self, but also that balance with that authenticity, and then the professional workplace. So that's interesting, because it's great to, I think it's really important that we bring our authentic selves to work, right? But I know for me myself, there is definitely like we still have to be conscious that, we're not just coming to work in our PJs or something, for example. Like, there is still that professional, what might be appropriate to wear for in a corporate setting, for example. Maybe what might be appropriate to say, what might not, but doing that and still being authentic. So having that balance between the two, it doesn't have to be like one or the other. So I thought that was really interesting that you cover that, and look at both of those aspects. Um and I really liked what you said about treating the question as a conversational prompt. So I think that's really interesting, because and we'll get to some of those questions in a bit, but sometimes we can be thrown off by certain questions. Maybe if we haven't memorized a specific, maybe they happen to ask a question that we weren't prepared for. We didn't, wasn't on our list of questions
Yeah,
that we.
yeah.
And instead of freezing up, maybe turning that into a conversation. So I think that's really interesting, and kind of feels a little better going into an interview, where you're like, okay, no matter what is asked, I know how to turn that into a interesting conversation, even if it's not necessarily like the perfect memorized answer, right? So I thought that's really cool as well. In terms of, oh, okay, so those were the couple of points that I just wanted to make, but does anybody have any questions on what Michelle's shared so far? Feel free to unmute, or you can throw it in the chat, whichever you like.
And another way to think about this, or another thing that I'm curious about, is how does everybody feel? How do you feel when presented with this reframe of interviewing? Like, how does it feel to think about that switch between, this isn't an examination that I might fail this test and get kicked out of college? Like, that's not what it is. How does it feel to reframe interviewing as a conversation? It might be scary, I think, a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, and speaking to the topic of dress, one of my, I guess I could call him a client. It was years ago, right after I had had my epiphany of, wait, maybe interviewing is a thing I do know how to do after all. And he was a colleague who was applying for a job as a teacher, and he was going to go to like a teacher job fair or something. And he was he was just coming out of college. He did not have a deep professional wardrobe. He did not have a lot of options there. And we kind of, and he wasn't comfortable with the sort of getting a shirt and tie and jacket kind of thing. And I was like, how about a sweater? How about a sweater and a pair of, when you're wearing a sweater, you don't necessarily have to have, the shiny shoes, but, figuring out how to, and that felt really authentic to him. He's like, oh yeah, a sweater, I can do a sweater, which is totally appropriate for a teacher. I think it was like K-12 teaching or something. So I really do like that piece of it. And then I'm also a real stickler for fit, for clothing fit. So if you ever want to know, if you ever want to, well, if I wasn't doing this, one of the things I could be doing is personal shopping, and making sure that you get a jacket that fits you correctly in the shoulders and that kind of thing. But okay, I see a question from Brooklyn. Big shift in perspective, feels less scary. Good. That's what I'm hoping for. Yeah, having stories to many different answers. Yeah, it is more authentic and manageable because you don't have to have that, oh crap, I memorized answers to 8 questions, and this question you asked isn't on my list. Like, what are you going to do in that context? Are you just going to say, oh, sorry, I didn't memorize the answer to that question? So yeah, it is a little more manageable when you have things to say no matter what.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna continue with my some of the questions I have for
Yeah.
you, Michelle. If but but of course the chat's still open. Feel free to throw it in there. Any questions that you have or comments. Um, and if you have a thought that comes up, you can unmute as well, and have we're open to having that discussion. Again, it's a smaller group, so it's nice, so we can actually have a conversation about some of the things that we're talking about here today. So that's available as well. So I know you talked about your different approach and coming in with stories and memorable moments. So I guess how can you respond to a question that throws you off or that you're not prepared for? So we did kind of talk a little bit about this, but um an example, for example, like I had an experience where I was applying for a business analyst role. I did a business analyst certificate like ages ago. So, you know, my information could have been out of date, but the job, what happened was during the interview, the hiring manager ended up asking me, tell me about the project life cycle, or tell me the order of the project life cycle. And that one kind of threw me off because my experience, I didn't have any experience with the project life cycle. I didn't learn that as part of my BA program. And I made sure I did like a light refreshing, covering some of the common topics of BAs, and that didn't really come up, so that kind of threw me off. Right, and so I'm curious, how would you, that might be one example, but how would you approach like a hiring manager asking you something like that where you're not prepared?
Yeah. Yeah, that honestly, I have like secondhand anxiety about that question, because especially when it's a situation of jargon where, project life cycle is you don't if you don't necessarily know what that means. If that wasn't something you study, if it's not something you've ever done, you just have no idea. It's a scary situation. And so I think the first step is to not panic, which is a good life thing. Like, no panicking is necessary. But it's okay to say, like, what do you mean by life cycle? Like, what does life cycle mean to you, or what kind of, because, and it sort of depends on if you can tell what kind of a thing project life cycle is. And sometimes you do, and sometimes you don't. And so if you do know what kind of thing a project life cycle is, you might be able to ask a question, something like, which project life cycle model are you using? If you know that there are many things like that. So my background's partly in design and design thinking. So if I'm and there are, like, if you Google like design thinking models or whatever, you get like 85 different things, and they're all pretty much the same, but there are different labels for the different steps, and sometimes there are 4, sometimes there are 5. And when Apir and I were talking about this, we Googled project life cycle also, and it was the same thing. Like, there are a bunch of different ways to think about it. And so if you know that it's a thing, that there are a bunch of different ways to think about it, or a thing where it's a kind of software that there are many different kinds of the softwares. So if they ask you what's your experience with Teams, and you don't know what Teams is, but if you can kind of tell based on the context that Teams is like Slack, then you can respond because you know what kind of a thing it is and kind of move forward from there. And you can also, so if you know what kind of thing it is, you can share that you can demonstrate that you're an insider by saying, oh, I haven't used that one, but I've used these other ones. So that's one scenario where if you know the thing. And I don't remember if you knew what project lifecycle was or just had no idea. But when you don't have any idea, like what is project lifecycle, then you might have to vamp a little bit. You might have to. It's kind of a stall, but not really, and say, "Oh, that's unfamiliar to me. Can you give me a quick synopsis of what a project lifecycle, what that is?" Because they may not know it's jargon. They may not know that that's common knowledge to them that isn't common knowledge to everybody else. They may not know that that specific program or specific model isn't the program or model everybody uses. And so you can ask a question back. And what that's demonstrating is that you are participating in the conversation, that you're able to say, oh, that's new information for me. Can you give me some background? Because I betcha that if they said something like, oh, well, the project lifecycle model that we use is blah 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 blah, you can then talk about the related experiences that you've had. You can talk about the times that you've managed projects, and then you can even say something like, you know what, I haven't necessarily thought about it as project lifecycle, but I have managed projects. And when I do that, this tends to be the way that I manage that process. Because they're, at the end of the day, if they are looking for you to have really specific knowledge of a very specific model or program or software or something, then they really should have put that in the job description. And if they put it in the job description, you would probably have looked it up if you weren't familiar with it, and then you wouldn't have been blindsided by the question. And so what that also tells you is that it's not that big of a priority. If it, yeah, but they will also be delighted to find out that you actually can manage a project, even if you're using slightly different terminology. And if they don't hire you because of that, then that's not, you have no way of knowing. It is not reflective of you if they choose to not hire you because of that. Also, it's probably not why they didn't hire you if they didn't hire you. And also, trying to guess why they didn't hire you or why they didn't move you forward or is absolutely pointless. It's fun to do, like we all do it, but I'm just here to tell you there's no reason to do it.
Yeah.
Okay, are there any parts of your question that I didn't answer all the way?
No, that was great. I really liked how you answered that. Because, you know, exactly like you said, like you I like how you're like, okay, even if you don't necessarily know what Teams are or Slack is, right? And it doesn't ring a bell or you have no unfamiliar, you're not familiar with either of those specific programs, but you ask that question, hey, not hey, but like, I may not necessarily know that specific program, but could you tell me more about what it's used for?
Yeah.
And then you might connect the dots as they're explaining it, like,
Yep.
oh, it's a communication tool. Yeah, we have something like that, but it's called this. I've
Yep. Yep. Yeah, no, and Rothy has a really good nuance here is what about if you don't know the answer to the question? Don't make stuff up. Don't talk about irrelevant things. And you're right about that. Like sometimes if you don't have an answer, it is best to say that you don't have an answer rather than making something up. And you do want to keep the relevance there. But I would say the I don't know the answer, you would save that for the super specific things like how many sales calls did you participate in the job you had 7 years ago? If they ask you a super specific question, then you would want to say, that's a great, I don't actually have that number on the top of my head, but what I can tell you is that did a lot of sales calls and I, had an 80% success rate or whatever. So it's almost an improv strategy of the yes and, or the never saying no. If it's a question where you really don't have any experience on the topic, like if I was interviewing for a job and I was qualified for all the things, if I met all of their requirements, but they wanted to know if I had coding experience or something, which is not that's not a question I will probably ever be asked. But if they just were like, oh, well, what coding languages do you know? And I was like, yeah, I actually don't know any. I would have to say, no, I don't know any, but I would want to say that in a way that makes it clear that I just happen to not have learned that yet. Maybe that might be a way I might answer that question. I might think, you know what? I was a little old to have learned coding as a kid, and that is something I've never done, and it is something that's kind of on my list of things to learn, which is partly true. But and you do want to say something that's partly true. Just for me, that's a bad example. So there's a fine line there, and if it's a tool or framework that you don't know that specific one, you would say that. You would say, I haven't used. So for me, so if you ask me a question about Photoshop, I would be able to say, I did Photoshop back in the late 90s and I really enjoyed it. I did some really fun projects in my classes and I haven't really touched it since. I would be delighted in this role to really dig back in and brush up on my Photoshop skills and find out what's changed in the last 25 years. And I would make a little joke about it. I would make a little joke that, it's been 25 years since I've done Photoshop. But what I'm doing is I'm saying I'm answering the question honestly, but I'm also making clear that, I'm the kind of person who's good at Photoshop. Like I'm not up to date on it right now, but I'm a design thinker, I'm artistic, I'm creative. I know how to manipulate things on the screen just fine, just as well as anybody. Have an eye for design, and that's what they need to hear about me.
Yeah. And I think,
Yeah.
right, if you're going into an interview where Adobe, it's like 5 years of experience in Photoshop, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they ask you if you know Photoshop, and you say that you don't have experience. That's a different situation.
Well, and that's a question. That's one of those things that you've covered that in your application. If
Mhm.
the job has Photoshop in the application, and if you applied anyway, and if they decided to interview you, then they already know you don't know Photoshop.
Mhm.
So that's another, and that's one of those things too, where that we need to keep in mind that job postings are often a wish list, and people sit together, your future colleagues and their bosses sit together and say, it'd be great if we could find someone who knows this and 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 this, and they put all of that into the preferred qualification section or in the nice to haves section, and they know they're not going to get somebody who knows all of those things. And so they know what you put on your resume, and so
Yeah.
you shouldn't get, if you get a question. Yeah, yeah. Did I just make things
It's a
more
good
complicated?
point. No, no, no. It's a good point because,
Yeah.
obviously they pulled your resume and they select it. You've
Yep.
gone through filters, they've selected you. So they know that maybe you may not have 100% of the skill that you're looking for, and they chose you because they're okay with that. And really, I guess the main goal there is you can say, hey, I may not know this, but you're still demonstrating that you have certain skills that say tell the interviewer that you're capable of learning those skills pretty quickly, because maybe in your resume you've demonstrated that you have other skills that are very similar, and you're just communicating to them, hey, just like you said, like I not don't know the specific, or maybe I've had experience in the past and I'm okay with brushing them up, and I'm excited to learn about it and refresh my skills.
Yeah.
I like that.
Oh, the feedback after an interview question. Okay, so here's the thing about asking for feedback after an interview. Thinking about the logistics of how the company doing the hiring, their system is pretty, they don't have a mechanism to collect feedback from the committee or from the evaluators and give it to the people who to the applicants. They don't have a mechanism for that. And there are so to ask for feedback, usually what that does is demonstrate that you don't really understand how the hiring process works. And there are a lot of different, so, and I should have started off this conversation by saying there's a lot of different perspectives on this stuff floating around out in the world, and I'm not necessarily, and it's, and the reason there are a lot of perspectives is that because on the other side, on the hiring side, there are a lot of different perspectives. So some people will, some interviewers or some, hiring managers will say, well, if people don't have a memorized whatever, then I'm not going to hire them. And other people are like, if people have a memorized response, I'm not going to hire them. And we're not going to guess. We're not going to know. We have no way of knowing. So all we can do is do what feels right for us and what we're comfortable with doing. All that being said, hiring the people who, especially if you don't get an interview, I guess, so if you don't get an interview, I think there's a lot of, bad advice floating around. If you don't get an interview, you should email and call and find out why you didn't get an interview. That is a waste of time. And all that does really is demonstrate that you don't know how it works. That they have, they got 45, applications for one job, and they picked the top 5, and you weren't one of the top 5, and they're not gonna go dig your resume out of the trash and be like, oh yeah, we didn't interview you because of this reason. Like, they're not going to do that. It doesn't make any sense for that to be a thing that happens. After an interview, sometimes, you are a part of a smaller group, and so it does feel like it feels like there should be a mechanism. It feels like, and this might go back to the thinking about interviews as exams thing now that I think about it. It feels like we should be able to go to the professor and say, why didn't I get a good grade on this test? And I feel that with you. Like, I want to know, like, I actually applied for a job not that long ago and I didn't even get an interview. And I was like, why didn't they even want to interview me? I was super qualified. But, it would have, if I had reached out and asked more information, I would have just been saying, hey, I would have been demonstrating I didn't know how the process works. So are they looking at every resume? That's another good question. There's absolutely no way to know. Absolutely no way to know. The cynical way to look at it is that they look at enough resumes until they have a pile of people that they want to interview, that they feel comfortable interviewing. And the reality is, is whatever it is. And it's going to vary. Some people, sometimes they are looking at every resume. Sometimes they're not. It's one of those, we're wasting time and energy trying to guess that thing. So did I give enough? Did I circle around to my point about asking for feedback where you can improve on an interview? Sometimes if you feel like you really had a good rapport with somebody, or if you knew somebody on the committee, then you might be able to reach out and say, hey, do you have a sense? That's happened to me before, where I did know somebody who, it was a small enough kind of situation that I was able to get a little feedback, which was very valuable. But that was not a usual thing.
Yeah, it's interesting because I have heard that same thing as well, where people will say, if you to reach out after after an interview for feedback if you didn't end up getting the job. And sometimes I've heard people respond, say that, well, you don't always get a response at all because they're busy.
Yep. Yeah. And that's the most likely outcome. If you ask for feedback, the most likely outcome is you will just not get a response back from your email, which makes sense because the person that your contact person, the person you would interview, that person is not in a position to pass along the information, because in order for them to tell you anything, they would have to ask the people who did the interviewing for their notes. Mm-hmm. And those notes are private and their conversations are private, and that's not something you can share. You can't share that with outsiders. And also, nobody has time for that. That's what I mean by there's no mechanism for the information about why they didn't hire you. There's no mechanism for that information to get back to you. So the most that the most that you would get is we went with another candidate who was better qualified or had more experience or was a better fit. And those things are irrefutable. Like you can't argue with those things
Or
really.
yeah, exactly. Because
Yeah.
it can't really get more deep into that. And it is also like, I was a hiring manager as well. And I know it is hard sometimes because it's just like, yeah, okay, this person was just a better fit. And I think I've received actually that response maybe
Yep. Oh
before.
yeah.
But it is, yeah, maybe you're not
Yeah.
going to necessarily receive the feedback that you want to
Right.
hear.
Right.
Um, so what would you recommend in that case? So you didn't do well.
Oh,
Is it just a mindset thing? Like, okay, you didn't do well. It's okay.
yep.
Go.
Yep. It's a mindset thing. And the reframe I like to do in this case is if you're getting interviews, that's the win. Getting the interview is the win. Especially the way the job market is right now, with all of the just sort of dust cloud of ATS systems and AI and just ghost job postings and internal hires and fake job postings and just absolute it's and those applicant tracking systems are a nightmare on the other side too, from what I've seen. And so there's so much dust, so much that if you're getting an interview, you are winning. You are at a new level. You're at a whole new level. So celebrate that you're getting the interviews. And then if you don't feel great about how the interview went, that might be a conversation to have with an interview coach, or that might be a conversation to have with yourself. This sort of, okay, why do I feel icky about how that interview went? If it's just that I didn't move forward in the process, if it's just that I didn't move forward in the process, the reframe is this: every single person they interviewed is perfectly capable of doing that job.
Yep.
Otherwise, they wouldn't have interviewed you. Getting the interview means I am qualified to do the job. They believe I can do the job. They are going to meet with 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 people, probably not 8. They're going to meet with a few people and choose the person that they want to do the job. And at that point, when you haven't gotten a job after an interview, it is a numbers game. And to be really, really honest, I think that they might as well just dartboard and choose a resume based on random chance, because I don't know, I'm not really convinced how good interviews are at predicting future success. I think it's what they invest into an employee that probably makes more of a difference in that employee's ultimate success in the role. But yeah, so if you didn't get a job and you feel okay, and if you put your best foot forward in the interview and you didn't get the job, then just the answer is to try and feel okay about it. Go ahead and feel crappy about it for a while, because we process those feelings, but then keep pushing forward, because it is a numbers game and eventually something will click. And you never know why. And my favorite example of you never know what's gonna put you in the slightly more exciting than the other perfectly qualified candidate's position is I had a friend years ago now. She got her PhD in mathematics and she had a minor in women's studies, and she got a tenure track job right out of PhD because she had a minor in women's studies, and that was the thing that made her stand out to them as a faculty member to add to their campus. And I just love that. I will say my minor in women's studies hasn't had that effect for me quite yet. But anyway, and then another great example is I have a friend who just last week got offered a job doing something that she's been a grant writer and she was an academic advisor, and then she just got a job as a grant writer for the Nature Conservancy. Her background's in rhetoric and composition and creative writing, and she has a few years of grant writing experience, but she doesn't have a background in ecology, except that she has a little bit. She has a little field work. She's got a sister in ecology, so she's familiar with the language and the conversations around conservation. And she has like little bits and pieces of conservation throughout her background. Most recently, she was an advisor for natural resources at a Research One institution. And so that was the piece, like those pieces all came together for her to turn into this really exciting grant writer position. So that, and I mean all of this as really as an encouragement that you never know what it's going to be about you that's going to put you right up there at the top of the pile once you're getting those interviews and actually talking to folks about why you'd
Yeah,
be a good fit for the position.
that's
Yeah.
really interesting because it's like it's almost like, oh, the stars aligned, and it's just it's
Yep.
so happened that something that's unique about them just was a perfect
Yep.
role. And
Yep.
I think that kind of speaks to some of the things that, just like you said, like it's not always planned, and why it's
Yep.
important to not be discouraged just because you didn't happen to get that one. Maybe, the saying like one door closes means the other door, there's still another door
Yeah.
that opens, right? And so um, it is, so interviewing can be tough, and it can be discouraging, but yeah, I guess it is important to remember, like, keep going. There is that right opportunity that's there, and don't give up. Just keep
Yeah.
going.
And keep working on your interview skills, whether it's with me or with another coach or on your own, like keep really thinking about who you are. Let's do the activity.
Yeah.
Um,
I was just gonna say, because we have about 9 minutes.
yeah, we just
in-
have a few minutes. Yeah. So thinking about those memorable moments, and this just as an absolute spoiler for everyone but Brooklyn, who may have seen this, the bigger version of this. Um, this is the beginning of working with me is we make a list of your memorable moments and then we really dig into them, and this becomes these become the seeds of the stories that you develop about yourselves. But I have some thinking about your memorable moment, and just kind of answer these questions for yourselves, and let's take a few minutes, just maybe write some scribbly notes or something about it, and think about the significance of the moment, and you don't have to answer all of these questions. Like you could complete this activity perfectly effectively by answering one of the questions, like answer the ones that feel relevant. And then at the end, how has it shaped you? How does it reflect you or your values? How does it connect to your experience and values and background, skills, experiences, what you know about yourself? Think about this stuff, and then see if you at the end can come up with a sentence or two about yourselves. And I can give my own example with the example I gave at the beginning. I had this moment where I gave a client a prompt to talk about himself just with a little different audience, and it really, the significance of that was that was really early in my coaching journey, and I wasn't sure if I was going to be good at it. I didn't know, like, do I really have something here that I can offer the world? And so it was really helpful to have that huge, it shaped me kind of, small but significant way. It was a big confidence builder. And let's not discount the role of confidence in all of this. And it really does reflect my values, because I really want to help people, and I want to provide a service that's helpful and valuable. And so it was reinforcing that this was a thing that was valuable to other people as well. And then it really, all of this, and this I say about my career path in general, just everything I've ever done recombines into the next thing every time. And this was really connected to, it was a moment where all the things I'd done before really came together and really reminded me that I do have some talent in this area, and I can offer it to the world. So I think, let's see, for a sentence, I think I came up with, I am a skilled teacher and coach, and I'm committed to meaningfully helping people become who they want to be. And side note that I do need to keep building my own confidence, because if that wasn't true, it wouldn't have made an impact on me to have that have happened to me. So, okay, so I'm going to shut up now for a few minutes and just everybody do a little reflection and writing, and then we'll have an opportunity to either put something in the chat. You can put your response in the chat, or you can unmute and share what your sentence ended up being at the end, if you're comfortable.
Yeah, and so while we're waiting, I will share my experience with this as well. Memorable moments, and I think this is actually what led me to getting my people management role, because I remember during my interview, I and it took me a couple of interviews actually to land before I actually landed the job. The team people management slash team leader was a specific title that I was applying for at the time. But I remember when she told me, I think the question was something along the lines of like, why this role specifically? Um, or it was connected to the tell me about yourself question. And I had brought up that I actually had a memorable moment with my team leader when I was reporting to someone, and how the way that they responded to me, and they were so open and willing to listen to, whatever I'd asked, and maybe my insecurities, how can it be better, and what my goals were, and they were really supportive. And how I really that stuck with me, and I said to myself that if I become a people manager in the future, that's the type of people manager I want to be, is to be able to be that kind and caring and encouraging to the people on my team. And I think that story really stuck with her and is really what made me stand out as the candidate. Even though I know some of the other people that I interviewed are super skilled and maybe potentially more skilled than I am, and had more experience working with the company than myself. Um, maybe not by a huge amount, but there was like, I know that, maybe I wasn't the best amazing in every single like checkbox list, right? But that story I think stuck with her, and it also connected with her vision for the team, right? Like she
Mhm.
wanted to
Yeah,
also build a team that was um aligned with what I was saying. And I think it's so
yeah,
interesting how much
yeah.
these stories make a difference.
I
Um,
love that because I love that for a bunch of reasons. Because I also want to reframe a little bit. You were the best person. That's why they hired you.
yes, yes,
Just to be, I'm gonna put my Captain Obvious hat on. You were definitely the best candidate, and that's what happens when you're the best candidate. But then best is very subjective, and this is also a great example of how best doesn't really mean it doesn't mean there's no I mean, yeah, it's a very subjective thing. But it also, what you were demonstrating too was that you're self-aware and self-reflective, and that you learn from people, and that you're thoughtful and empathetic. So there's also that subtext too of really showing in an interview, really showing that you're a thoughtful person who incorporates new information really effectively and observes from others. And yeah, I love that. I love it so much.
yeah.
I put my link and email into the chat, but I want to hear from other folks if you've got a little reflection statement figured out, or just thoughts.
Yeah, feel free to unmute or put it in the chat. Either way works.
I also have a follow-up comment about the asking for feedback thing. There is a small exception here if you're working with a job placement service or recruiter or something like that, because in that kind of context, there might be a mechanism for you to get feedback about why you weren't moved forward in the process or whatever. But that would be a question for your recruiter or for that job placement service, not the company that was interviewing you. Okay, thank you, Brooklyn. First person asked, did I flagship your own product? What a fun gig that would have been. And it affirmed that you are trustworthy, talented. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, I love that. Yeah,
Wow.
you have skills and talents.
So how would so I have a question for you, Michelle, based on what Brooklyn shared. So where would she kind of bring that up in an interview question, for example? Like where would
Oh, yeah.
it made it fit?
Yeah, so it depends. There's so many pieces that could be going on here. But being the first person to take on a role, that is a valuable position to have held. That is a valuable experience to have had. Because what you can say about that, because that transfers and into a lot of different, if you're applying for anything that has any start a program, develop a program, build a team, start a whatever, anything where you're starting something or being the first person to do something, like this story or the story that comes out of this experience of this moment, that become like you can talk about that. You can talk about that all day long, probably. So that there's that being the first person to do a thing is a very valuable card to play in an interview. And it could be, you could talk about that in relation or in response to a question about building something from scratch, in response to a question about dying, in response to a question about yarn, in response to a question about working in a boutique yarn brand kind of context, or any kind of boutique product, any kind of retail product, you know, any kind of manufacturing or production or packaging. Like there's so many different things that this could be related to, that the story just becomes really, really multi-purpose. Versatile is the word I wanted. Multi-purpose also works. And yeah, and then, you know, then there's a lot more here too about the being trustworthy, being talented, work ethic, high quality product that is worthy of the brand. So that demonstrates awareness of how your work dyeing the yarn is related to the bigger picture of the brand. So if you're ever applying to anything that has anything to do with an early state, you know, of manufacturing of something, being a person, being an applicant that's aware of how that fits into the bigger picture of the brand and the customer awareness and that kind of thing, that's gonna be impressive. You're not just coming in saying, oh yeah, I'm gonna dye the yarn, or I'm gonna whatever the job might be, the production job. You're able to, you know, to extend that out to a bit broader context. And Abir, I don't remember what question you asked, but the question I'm answering is what would you do with this? And the answer might be there's a lot you can do.
Yeah, exactly. So that was my question. Yeah, I really like that because it like you took, so you were able to take that one story and apply it to so many different roles and so many different scenarios. And
Yep.
exactly like you said, like this is how the stories become so versatile. You have this store, this like you go into an interview with these few stories and you're able to, if there's a question about leadership, if there's a question about exactly how do you start something from scratch,
Yep. Yep.
want you to
Yep.
lead this program, right? So tell me
Yep.
about
How do
yeah.
you talk about a time when you worked with other people? Well, you know, maybe there weren't other people involved, but maybe there was somebody else who was putting the labels on, and then you could talk about how you were coordinating with the label person to get the things ready and whatever. And yeah.
Okay, I love that. Okay, well, it's 6:03. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you for joining today. Thank you, Michelle, for taking the time to have this wonderful chat. I really thought that was really a lot of useful information there, and I loved the exercise that we did. Um, Stay tuned for
I
the
think
record.
I have one more. I think I have a goodbye slide.
Oh, sorry. Yes, let me go there. Okay.
Oh, it just has my email address again.
Yes, please reach out to Michelle if you have any, if you liked anything that we talked about today, if you wanted to explore further. Michelle, sorry, you can do your closing, but
No, this is great. Yeah. My website will have a way to book a call, just a free call if you want to talk more about stuff, and see if there's a way that we can work together. I have a couple of like preset packages, but I'm also playing around with like a la carte things. So just kind of figuring out what works for people and designing something that makes sense.
awesome.
Just depends on what everybody's needs are. But thank you so much, everybody, for hanging out.
Thank you. Awesome. Stay in touch. If you like today's seminar and you want to hear some more things like this, follow me on Instagram. You have Michelle's contact there. My Instagram's at careercoach.apira. My email I put in the chat, apiraraja@gmail.com. I'll send out a follow-up email with our recording if you want to revisit today's conversation. Or if you want to reach out to Michelle or myself as well in the future. So thank you for joining and hope to talk again soon.
Good luck
Bye.
out there, everybody. Bye bye.
Bye.